by the Right Reverend Dr Vicentia Kgabe, the Bishop of Lesotho, who's with Sarojini, a co-editor of the book she showed us earlier, Ecumenical Encounters with Desmond Tutu, and who, previous to being the Bishop of Lesotho, which incidentally was a post that Desmond Tutu himself held, was the rector and principal of the College of the Transfiguration in Grahamstown, which he was also instrumental in setting up through an amalgamation. So Sarojini, over to you and the other guests.
Thank you so much, Linda. Just checking that I can being heard.
Yes.
It's great. Fantastic. And I see Mpho on my screen now as well. So I am really, really pleased this afternoon to be joined by these two phenomenal women and to engage in conversation with two really what I would women icons for that's the way I would describe them. They are two very powerful women that I am blessed to call friends and also privileged to look up to. Thank you, Mpho and Vicentia, for joining me in conversation this afternoon. Apologies from Reverend Renee August, who's in her sick bed. We met with her yesterday and she really didn't sound great. So we kind of prepared that she may not join us today. And she did send me a text earlier to say that she can't join us, but I think we'll be evoking her a lot in our conversation because we did have a really great conversation yesterday in preparation for today's session. So thank you again for joining us. When we spoke about what we'd like to be the content of this session, before we could get into the content, the question that we asked Vicentia was, how are you? and I'm going to, and she said, I feel loved. And I think poor Renee and I were like, oh, wow. Okay, not exactly what we were expecting to hear, but that was her answer. And so I'm going to ask you, Vicentia, to start there, because I think starting there fits in quite well from the previous session we had, but also starting there is a good starting point, because as I said yesterday, I think that when we work in the area of gender justice, so much of what we are doing constantly is struggle. And to hear the word love being brought into the conversation was beautiful. So tell us a little bit more about that, Vicentia, and welcome again.
Thank you, Prof. Saroj and Maruti Tutu. I am feeling loved because I'm in a new context for me and a new office, which our beloved Arch was here in 1976 to 1978. And the diocese that I now have the responsibility and the honor of leading has had troubled times. So as I crossed the border from South Africa to come to Lesotho to take this responsibility, as I said, the walls were up, the fists were ready to battle, because I thought I was going into a context that is going to be troublesome and all sorts of not so nice things. I was disarmed by the love of the people of the Mountain Kingdom. I am surprised of how that has enabled me to be the leader that I was not ready for in this context. And as I said, I am learning to receive love and to be loved by those that I lead. As when I was at the College of Transfiguration, mine in the class was to tell my students, you're going to a context where no matter what, love the people of God through and through. So I'm learning to take my own advice at this moment.
Thank you. Thanks, Vicentia. Mpho, when we spoke yesterday, you said, if I recall correctly, this is actually quite in line with my father's legacy, and this is exactly the kind of reception that he would have wanted for Vicentia. Tell us a little bit more about that, Mpho. Mpho, I think you are muted. Ah, we heard something, but then it...
Mpho, are you on a Mac or on a PC? If you hover if you hover your mouse at the bottom, you may get up a bar which has got a microphone on it. Can you see a symbol of a microphone? Or you can write in the chat.
She says that she's not muted.
Mm-hmm. It may then be to dial out and dial back in, might solve it.
Okay.
Or
I think Mpho is going to try to connect from another device. Yeah. In the meantime, maybe while Mpho is doing that, Vicentia, if I could just come back to you, maybe to ask a little bit about the role of the Archbishop in your own journey to ordination and I suppose your final consecration as bishop as well.
Yeah. I'm one of the people who are the result and the product of his dream and his vision as he came into the archiepiscopacy. He mentioned three things as he came in as the things that he really was looking forward as the leader of our church then to accomplish. One was to end apartheid or work alongside those who wanted to end apartheid. Secondly was women ordination, and not just to ordination, but to the episcopacy. And third was the full inclusion of LGBTIQ plus persons into the church. And I think like many young South Africans, I now can live and lead in a context that is free of apartheid. And secondly, that I am an ordained person in the Anglican Church, and I am the first woman bishop for the Diocese of Lesotho, which he led, and the third diocesan in the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, and the fourth woman to be ordained in the continent of Africa. And it is through him not just saying things, but praying through things and actively making sure that things do happen. So some of us are really mindful that there's so many people led by him and worked alongside him who made it possible for some of us to be where we are at this moment.
And I want to take a moment actually to acknowledge that and to celebrate that. I don't think any of us take for granted the journey that it has been, both to end apartheid and to towards women's ordination, and as you say, rising to the episcopacy. And we are going to talk about the third aspect of his vision, which hasn't been fully realized in the church, and that is the area of sexual diversity. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. I don't know if we have Mpho back yet. Mpho?
I think Sophie's just resending her the link.
Ah, I see. Okay. All right. So sorry, I'm now it seems like we're in a dialogue, Vicentia, but we're pretty comfortable with that, I think. So
for sure.
Vicentia, in 2017, I recall that we met in Johannesburg, and I was invited as an honorary Anglican. I think I always say I'm not Anglican, but some of my best friends are. To the meeting where we were commemorating 25 years of women being ordained in the Anglican Church. And something that came up over and over again in that meeting was the work that remains to be done, right? That while ordination was the goal, the challenges and the work that women experience in ministry remain. And so maybe you want to say a little bit about that and where you see the church currently. I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot there, but yeah.
I think I'm on a spot. There's something you're on a spotlight on my computer now, so I'm on the spot. Yes, work remains to be done. When in 2017, when we met, we only had 2 women consecrated bishops in the Anglican province of Southern Africa. And last year, September, when I was elected by the Synod of Bishops, we had only 1 because Bishop Elena had passed on early January. And, so Bishop Elena being consecrated the first bishop in 2012 and having the 3rd coming in 2021, it shows you the gap and how slow the process is. And we still have the unwillingness of clergy and lay persons, regardless of gender, who are still resistant on women in leadership. I'm in a context where when people say bishop, they think that is naked. They need to clothe that terminology. So in Lesotho, they will say Morena Bishop, which means chief or king bishop. That is very strange for me, or the honorable bishop, because that's how they think they need to respect this. But it's interesting when I ask people, why are you saying that? They say, because you're doing a job that is done by men. So we used to call him men, Morena Bishop, the Lord Bishop, Chief, and all those kind of things. So to even be in this space where I am, regardless of the journey that I have walked and that my sisters have walked and are still walking, we're still seen as doing the man's job. If they're talking about Brother Jesus, thumbs up. But if they're talking about another man, just because the church had created that space that allowed men to be preferred for leadership for many years until 1992, that's why I'm saying work still needs to be done. There are fewer women sent to theological colleges by their dioceses. There are fewer women studying theology in our universities. There are fewer women who are full-time or stipendiary in our dioceses. So the fewer they are, then there will be fewer in leadership. And there will be, at other times, no women nominated for office of bishop. So the struggle continues.
Yeah, thanks, Vicentia, but I think you touched on an important aspect when you spoke about the problems with language and finding a language for you. And last year, was it last year, when we met to talk about the problem of gender-based violence in South Africa, and we issued a call to the Anglican Church in particular about examining deeply and critically examining the kinds of theologies, the kinds of language that uphold gender-based violence. And gender-based violence is sort of, the extreme. And what we hear over and over again when we approach this is, big statements, it must be stopped, it's terrible, whatever. But there is a reluctance to address the root of the problem, which lies in our theologies, which lies in our language. It's not innocent, right? And the ways in which, and so do you think that part of the problem with the ways in which the church engages gender is that it's a transformation by numbers approach, okay, we now have women in leadership, or we now have women bishops, but there's a refusal perhaps to engage with the underlying principles, the underlying beliefs, the underlying theologies that actually prop up these negative experiences that women are experiencing in the church. Mpho, I see you are back. I'm not sure how much of that.
Hopefully with sound. Yes.
Can hear you, yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Language is a problem, and it is part of the foundation of this church and the society we live in. That, patriarchy and its systems, that a woman belongs to the father, then belongs to the husband, then belongs to the son. That when you ask people, what is your name? They don't tell you the name. They tell you the title or the office they occupy as if it's their name. I am Father Sarojini. And I think that enforces to know where you stand with me. And because it's important, that it's okay for me to say Mpho Tutu, but to another colleague, Father so and so. And I think that continues to say, you are not worthy of that office. When we're now saying, when you think of offices of leadership, whether it's rector, archdeacon, dean in the church, think of women, people think then that means men won't be nominated anymore because women have taken over. So language in how we address God, people negating the experiences that we have with God, that when you don't say Father, that's blasphemy to some. How dare you call God Creator, God Sustainer, God Redeemer? God is your Father. Forgetting how that sits in other aspects on what terminology of Father is. So we are struggling with that in so many ways, and how it gets perpetuated by those in leadership.
Thank you.
It's also that challenge of seeing that the God who created people in God's image created all of us in our amazing diversity and beauty in God's image. So whether we gender God as he, she, they, is also something that's really important in terms of really expressing the welcome that God truly extends to all of us. And I know I have a Bible study group that I lead in a congregation here in Amsterdam, and we read different English translations of the gospel texts, and sometimes I will regender the translation. And one of the members of the group said, why did you regender this? Why, and actually regendered Jesus. Jesus was a man. Why did you regender this? I said, well, we walk into churches all over the world and see a white man as the face of Jesus, and that's fine. Whereas if we recognize that Jesus was a Jew from Palestine, it's very unlikely that he was blonde with blue eyes. And we're fine with that. Why is it such a challenge to imagine Jesus regendered?
Exactly. And I think the challenge is because language shapes reality, right? Language shapes the ways in which we think. And so if we make those shifts, then we will make shifts in other spaces. And I think therein lies the reluctance. What's interesting, if we come back to the legacy of the arch, is that people are very willing to accept, and Mpho, and I'd like to hear from you about this, but people are very willing to accept the forgiving arch and the all-embracing arch and the arch who talks about reconciliation, etc. But like with Jesus, I think the arch that says "woe to you" is often ignored. And I don't know if either of you would agree with me, but especially in areas of gender and sexuality. At least that has been my experience, even working in the context that I do. Would you think that that's a fair assessment?
I think, well, both the Jesus and the arch who say woe to you are not necessarily the visions that we want to hold in our hearts and minds. Remembering that the woe that Jesus spoke wasn't a curse.
Exactly.
The woe that Jesus spoke was a warning. It was, watch out. Watch out how you treat these people. Watch out how you live in your joys, because joy isn't promised as your everyday experience. Health and well-being are not going to be your everyday experience. It's not necessarily so that you are going to be fed today and fed tomorrow. And so watch out. And I think that we're living in a world now, and maybe especially in Europe, where we were very willing to rename refugees as migrants and then say they're not entitled to human rights and care, until, you know, and then those refugees start being Ukrainian as opposed to Syrian, and that, you know, the woes actually were in the lectionary a couple of weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, and the woes were the warning to all of us. Don't think that that war is the sole experience of Syrians and Lebanese and Yemenis and Congolese. Don't think that it can't come here, because it can. And now we're living with the experience of living into the woe.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think yesterday when we were having the discussion about love, Renee said it quite well. She said, so those who claim to have loved the arch have to also recognize the ways in which the arch challenged us, the way and I suppose to relate that to what you were saying, Mpho, those who claim to have loved the arch need to also understand the woe, need to also accept the woe, and the wagging finger, if you like, and that then brings me to the next part of our conversation, which is about sexuality. And the arch over, the world over, is known for his solidarity with those who identify as LGBTQI plus, and he's been known, immediately after apartheid, he said that if the church was looking for a new moral crusade. After apartheid, this was it. It was in the area of sexual diversity. And of course, then in 2013, he goes down in history of his most famous saying, I would rather go to hell than to go to a homophobic heaven. And in many respects, as we said earlier, Vicentia, this is the part of his legacy that it remains unfulfilled. This is the part of what he wanted when he became Archbishop that remains unfulfilled. Perhaps I could hear from both of you about where you think we are in that process and in honoring his legacy.
One thing that I've learned that we're good to talk about love, but it's tough to act on that love. And we're good to talk about a God who created all in God, God's likeness and image. But we're the ones who pick who has the image and who does not. And I think that has been a barrier, because then, yes, God, you can say this, but we can turn this around and choose who sits with us and who eats with us, who's in and who's out. And I think the church is trapped into that, on creating the church in its own likeness. Deciding who is invited to the table or who's not, deciding who gets the blessing and who doesn't. And we have to, I think, now say, who are we? Which identity and image are we talking about here? Because if we are worshiping the God that we worship, what we're doing is truly not what we are called to be. And it goes to the struggle of language. It comes to the struggle of ideologies and of interpretation. And, in Southern Africa, we say it was women who were put out. We know the struggle. And the same pattern is being repeated again in our brothers and sisters who are not welcomed fully into the church.
Thank you. Mpho, you in a sense, I mean, you've said that the three visions that your dad had, you are in a way a direct beneficiary of his visions for a more inclusive church. Could you take us through some of that and through some of your journey?
Yeah, I'm going to just do a tiny little piece of preface, which is to say that what is always interesting to me in the conversations about human sexuality is that when we talk about heterosexual marriage, we talk about love, as though there's no sex in it. And when we talk about unions that are anything other than heterosexual, they are unions for sex, and there's no love in it. And of course, then we're too prudish to actually talk about sex. And so then the conversation gets shut down before it's even open to be started. And then to answer your question, Sarojini, I am the direct beneficiary of the three causes that my father addressed. I was South African woman living under apartheid, and so his struggle against apartheid directly benefited me. My father, without knowing that I, or neither of us at that point knew that I had any vocation to ordained ministry, but that also was a cause that he took up, was the full inclusion of women in ordained ministry. And so I have been a beneficiary of his adherence to that struggle. And then, of course, I am married to my beautiful wife, whose computer I'm now borrowing, and have been absolutely the beneficiary of my father's stance on human sexuality. And the thing that I observe time and again with the struggles that he took on, and then in and around the time of his funeral, was that you know, for so many people, my father was a hero and an icon. But not only that, because for so many of us, what he did was personal, and where he met us was personal. It wasn't just the, you know, great, wonderful icon out there doing amazing things. It was the absolutely human person who really took account of our lives as we lived them and cared about that. And that is my father walking in the footsteps of the Christ who he worshipped.
I'm so glad that you brought into the conversation the ways in which he sought to live out his public his public persona in his personal life. And I don't know if you remember this, Mpho, but when I took up the position as chair, I came to visit you and Dad at the foundation, and he asked me in that meeting, we were having tea, what are you going to do in this position as a research chair? And I said, I don't know, but one of the first things I have to do is I have to give an inaugural lecture. And he said to me, so what are you going to speak about? And I still shrugged my shoulders and I said, I don't know. And he said, you know, and I'm not going to say it in the language that he said, but he said, what is the thing that's bothering you the most at the moment? And I shared the experience of a family member a trans family member who had attempted suicide, and how it was so deeply hurting me at the time. And he says, well, that's what you must speak about. Speak about what is igniting your passion in this moment. And then he told the story, and which is how he brought it quite personal, about your wedding, and how, you know, he wasn't allowed to give this official blessing, but how he gave a blessing anyway. But I remember him saying in this very animated way, in the way that he could, he said, so what was I supposed to say? Was I supposed to go, hey, God, this is my daughter over here, and I want you to give her a blessing. And, you know, the church is not allowing it, but I give her my blessing. And for me, that was so powerful in the way in which he related it to me, in that it wasn't just his public persona and the kinds of, you know, great sound bites that have become sound bites that people use as sound bites, but I could sense his deep and personal passion for you as his daughter, but also for the broader issue. There was a way in which he brought the structural and the personal together in quite marvelous ways, I think. But as we said, with the, you know, with the aspect of gender, in the aspect of sexuality, the work is still remains to be done. And I suppose I want to ask Vicentia, you, and also Mpho, what is this work that remains to be done? What more can one do beyond the kinds of, you know, he had this amazing ability to call out the hypocrisy in the theologies, right, that are being peddled or whatever. But what else? What remains to be done to carry this legacy forward? And that third aspect, that unfulfilled part of his legacy. Vicentia?
He was in Lesotho for 2 years. And 46 years later, the people of this country have never forgotten him and what he did in this church. And because he was authentic, what he lived, what he preached, what he did in service, it was him through and through. And we know now that his prayer life powered what he did when he left. He was not a person who just only prayed in the chapel. He prayed everywhere. So for those of us who are now responsible for the cure of souls in the church, is for us to be authentic and to be true to the gospel of Jesus Christ, that God has called all of us. So you could see there was a Tutu in all of us there, that we are welcomed, we were included. He was consistent. It could have been tiring. He could have jumped into the next big issue, hot issue. So it's an issue of us being consistent and longevity and speaking truth to power, but just not speak it, but act on it. So that's a legacy, that we carry the burden and we continue, maybe with a kind of better speed than his, but we are part of a process and a generation and a church that has to be welcoming, affirming, inclusive, and acknowledging all of God's people.
Thank you, Vicentia. Mpho?
I can only add and amplify what Vicentia has said. Memo Bishop.
It's so nice to say that, right?
Yeah. But the thing that keeps getting re-emphasized about my father's life was that it was a life of prayer and a life of action. The action drove him to his knees, the prayer drove him into action. And it was consistently and constantly so. Sometimes we go to God with our laundry list. Here, do this, fix this, change this, arrange this, and send this. But sometimes we need to experience the invitation to go to God with our ears and our hearts open. And it is to wait on the word and trust that God will speak into our waiting. The church will be fully inclusive. The church will be a place of genuine welcome. The church will be a place that speaks with the voice of prophecy. I know and believe that to be so, because I know the God we worship. And sometimes it is just to just give it a minute. Give God a minute or more and wait to hear the direction, because the direction will come.
Yeah.
And we can trust that.
Yeah.
I'm just sitting here listening to both of you. I'm in awe of the hope that both of you have for this church that has often not been very kind to you. I'm going to say it because I can. but the enormous hope that you hold out for this church. And I think that we've been talking about the legacy and how to live out the legacy and how to keep alive the Archer's legacy. And I think that's embodied in the both of you as leaders, as as women that other younger women are looking up to, is this hope in spite of. It's your laughter, it's your humor, it's your humility in all of that gives me hope, I think. But yesterday, again, when we, and I want to circle back to this idea of love that Vicentia raised yesterday when she said she feels so loved. But you also said that you were surprised by the love, and that you were scared of the love, and you were maybe even a little bit suspicious of the love, and so what for me is so inspiring, but by what about what each of you have shared, is that while holding that surprise and suspicion and fear, it doesn't mean that you need to let go of the hope. And for me, that's what we see in the Archer's life, and I think that's the greatest testimony that each of you can bring in terms of how you live out his legacy. I'm going to ask you both very quickly, because I see we've got 3 minutes on the clock, to simply give us some parting words of wisdom, or what, something that you would want to share with us. We've had a very rich conversation, but perhaps, and specifically focused, I would ask, on those who are struggling, I think, to find that hope. You both are filled with hope, but I imagine that there's people there that are struggling to find hope. So yeah, parting word.
He lived to be what, 91?
90.
And his birthday is 3 days later than mine. So, and this is a man inspired, and despite all of that, trusted the journey, and trusted the one who is the creator of the journey. And he has moved into the unknown in so many ways, and still held hope. And so who are we to want to give up now, when things in other spaces look easier than what he had done? So though his body is resting, his soul is with his creator, his memory and his passion and his fire lives in us and in many of us. And that's the hope that makes us to try to ride a horse like he did, climb the mountain, preach like he did, and pray like he did. So there's, his fire and passion is in us. And ours is just to be grateful that we got to have him in our lives for this long and to learn.
Thank you, Vicentia. I want to hear about that horse riding, but that will be for another time.
Just small note, he fell off the horse.
Yeah.
But that's a story for another time as well. He always talked about how it wasn't him, how when someone stands out in a crowd, it is because they are standing on the shoulders of others. And so as tough as the journeys can look, don't forget that we are the others.
Yes.
That these are the shoulders that he was standing on.
Mm-hmm.
And that the world changed because we helped the world to change. And if we want the world to be different, we just have to keep on pushing.
Thank you so much. This has been a really wonderfully refreshing conversation. I think so often when we speak in these two areas in particular, gender and sexuality, it's so fraught with struggle. And today, I think what we've found is what Renee called yesterday, the audacity to love and the audacity to hope in spite of. And so I think if there's no other message that we take away from this session. That's what I would think that we can. So thank you so much to both of you, inspiring, phenomenal women.